Hey, how's it going?
Hi, you're listening to
In at the end
podcast.
podcast.
We just watched episode 3, Denial, Anger, Acceptance, and it's one actually I don't think we've talked that much about before. I think in some ways it's a little bit of a build-up episode. In some ways it's a little bit of a like setting the scene for more things episode. So I think in the past I haven't given it enough credit for the episode that it is. And actually watching it tonight, I really enjoy it. Like for me now, that kind of is a standout in some ways. It introduces some things that are really pervasive throughout the whole series.
It is. I think there's a lot of exposition. I think it does start to get the plot moving, but I think it's interesting. I think it also starts to delve a lot deeper with some characters for the first time, and we start to see the depth that everybody in Soprano World's going to have.
Yeah.
I think that's really cool.
Yeah, but I think there's just also like I don't know. Maybe it speaks to me more, and maybe we'll talk more about the capacity of art to speak to you in a moment. But maybe it speaks to me more now than it has in the past, also. And I was going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Or at least that's what I was thinking about when I was watching this episode. Last week, I think we started with the title. Do you want to start again this week with the title?
Denial, anger, acceptance.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting, and those are the 5 stages of grief, right? So these are the stages that, those are 3 of the 5 stages of grief.
In coping with death. So no?
In coping with grief, like grief over anything. I mean, typically, like things you grieve over do include death, obviously. But the order of them, as they're kind of sold as a package, it goes denial, anger, and then bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. So we're missing out on the bargaining and the depression.
Right.
And so just by like thinking about the title this week, I was like, there's a reason why they left those out, right? I think actually the reason why they left those out is I saw more of bargaining and more of depression in that episode than I saw of the other stages of grief.
Oh, interesting. I was actually about to go the other route with that.
So I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about like what it is that, like, why they chose this, right? Like, is there something that, like, what is it that Tony's really grieving about? Mm-hmm. So I want to delve into the title a bit.
Right.
But you go. Tell me what you were thinking about. Yeah.
Well, I think with Tony, I think we see more denial and anger along the way to dealing with grief than anything else. In terms of his angry outburst that he has with Artie, that he has with Dr. Melfi, I think he's definitely constantly denying things in his life. The way that he denies his complicity in creating the world around him and creating destruction and introducing these questions of is he a golem or a Frankenstein or a monster? And I don't see as much bargaining and depression, at least in this episode, especially depression. I think that's something that is focused on at other times in the season. But in this one, it's more these angry outbursts that kind of become the center point.
Depression was actually mentioned twice, and now I'm forgetting the second time it was mentioned. But when he's in the kitchen with Artie, he calls him a depressed jerk or something like that. Or a depressing jerk.
Right.
And then, I can't remember the other time that he uses, and he calls someone else depressing, or another situation. He calls the painting depressing.
That's right.
He calls,
which is,
we'll talk about the painting
interesting.
Also. But I do see, so anyways, that kind of covers the depression thing. I don't know, again, I just feel like there's important when things are being left out, and there's importance about why those are being left out. So maybe you have more to say about what your theory on that is. But I didn't see depression as much as I saw bargaining, and I think particularly like in the scenes with the Hasidic divorce that's going on in the episode, there is this level of, not in the way that the 5 stages of grief deal with bargaining, but there is this level of bargaining in order for people to get out in the best way possible. And that's typically what happens in grief in a lot of ways. It's like, well, like if this happens, then I can be okay with this, or yeah, if this,
Right.
then this, right? So I think like with Jackie, for example, like a lot of those scenes in the hospital, I want to delve more into those also. So this is always challenging just to talk about the title because it's really usually indicative of the whole episode. But a lot of those scenes with Jackie, you really see Tony, like when he gets the stripper, right? It's like, well, if I give him this joy, like
Yeah.
maybe that'll make this okay, or that'll make this easier to deal with. Because I mean, again, we'll go into this after, but again, like when he talks about Jackie in Melfi's office, his voice has this, I don't know, this quality to it that is just so sad.
Yeah.
And so like it's clear that this is something that's so hard for him to deal with, is the death of his friend. It's coming out in
Right.
anger, and it's coming out in denial, right? So maybe that part with the stripper is also a little bit of denial too.
Right.
But I think it is that, like, well, if I do this, this will be okay.
That's really
Yeah.
interesting, though. I think maybe when I was saying I didn't see as much bargaining and depression, that was for Tony. And I was really looking from the perspective of Tony. But if you look at other characters, like, for instance, Artie, perhaps he's engaging in more depression and bargaining than the other steps along the way to acceptance.
I
of
forgot
grief.
about.
Because, and maybe that's part of it, is that all these characters are dealing with grief in different ways, but there are these kind of flawed human ways where they don't accept all parts that are necessary to reach a conclusion of dealing with grief in your life. I was trying to think of what are the examples of people dealing with grief in this episode. So we have Artie, who's dealing
Grieving
with
his restaurant.
grieving his restaurant. He talks about it like it's losing a limb.
Yep.
And we have Tony responding to that. We have Jackie in the hospital. That's definitely a prime example. And we have not only Tony, but everybody in the family
Yeah.
dealing with it in different
Well,
ways.
including, like, I guess just like a funny moment is Mikey.
Right.
And he deals with it in this, like, very kind of depressing. Actually, that's another instance, I
Right.
think, where they do call him a depressing motherfucker,
That's right.
I think.
Depressing motherfucker.
But where he deals with it in this, like, kind of like, well, I know this person and this happened to them, right? And there's people out there who definitely, like, if they have a family member who's sick or dying, like, that's where they lean to. And then we have other characters dealing with it in these other variously, successful ways.
Yeah.
And
Even Charmaine really dealing with grief over the restaurant and how she's going to move forward, and also engaging with that in a completely different way too, of kind of taking that out on Carmela in the end.
Yeah.
In
In
this
the
kind of
best
power
best
dynamic.
way possible.
It's a pretty good way to do it.
Yeah.
But we'll get to that. Why don't we
Yeah.
kind of go through the episode and talk
Sure.
about the things that were standing out to us?
Sure.
I think we could start at the beginning, because I think that kind of sets up some of the dynamics. I mean, right at the top, we have Chris and Brendan, and Junior and Mikey, kind of being compared back to back. We have Chris and Brendan in a car with this kind of like flashy lighting.
Red lighting.
They're doing cocaine in the car.
There's techno music.
There's techno music. It really kind of evokes the exact same environment that we had when they were at a club in the previous episode.
Yeah, it's even kind of like jerky. Like, it's like, I don't know, there's something about the filming or their body movements. Like, they're clearly high.
Yeah. It's definitely evoking that. And then Junior and Mikey is the complete opposite. They're playing jazz, and there's these paintings behind them.
What was the jazz in that scene?
Actually, it wasn't even really jazz. It was like
Huh.
piano music.
Okay.
It was light piano.
Sorry, Alex is a jazz
Soothing.
musician, so it's helpful
Good.
sometimes.
I can throw in some completely useless jazz knowledge later on in the episode when I can tell you what jazz standard they were playing, but
Cool.
that's about as useful as that skill set's going to be for this.
Cool.
But I do think that they're comparing them and tying it into the themes of the last episode of this kind of old guard and new guard. The paintings behind Junior and Mikey of these kind of ancient structures that have been maintained. And actually what I love about this episode is it really introduces the concept of using a painting
I know.
to
We're gonna have to
communicate.
we're gonna have to go into that one. Like,
There's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot.
And the show loves that, and
I love that.
I love it in general. I mean, I feel like this show taught me how to watch film and TV in so many ways. Just
Totally.
knowing that everything is so intentional, and anything in the shot is deliberate and communicating something. And the show does such a great job of that, and the paintings are a great example of having an image communicate so much about what the show is trying to communicate at any given point.
Okay, let's come back to it, because I also have some more stuff to say about that too.
Yeah. Well, that immediately moves into Tony being at Melfi's office, and they move again to focus on a painting of this rotted tree, or this, what Tony calls a Korshak.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I love the way the camera shows you where Tony's eyes are focusing.
Yeah.
That's just like, and that's like, for me, I don't know where that, like, who that's inspired by or where that comes from, or if that's Chase. I don't know. But
it's just great acting. I think it's just such great facial control from James Gandolfini. It is
also that,
of course,
like, you know, and I feel like I'm seeing it through his eyes, and it's a really powerful thing. Yeah. But yeah, I love that scene with the Korshak / well, it's actually, like, you know, he is referring to a Rorschach test. And I love how she plays dumb on that one too. Like, she obviously knows what a Rorschach test is, but she focuses on the fact that Tony thinks that she's trying to trick him.
Yeah.
Which the tricking comes up in a number of different ways too in this episode.
One thing that I liked about that I thought was really interesting was Tony focusing on this painting of a tree and nature and this barn. And I started noticing in this episode that there was a lot of examples of the composition including some greenery and some nature in the shot. And I think that was very intentional. So we have Tony focusing on the tree. We have, when Tony's in Melfi's office, behind Melfi is greenery. We have in the scene where he's meeting with Shlomo, outside Satriali's, there's some greenery kind of like on the side of the shot. When he's in Artie's garage, it's very dark. It's not lit very well, but you see all this greenery that's kind of very bright outside.
Peripheral, yeah.
There's a lot of it, and actually it got me thinking about what we were talking about on the ducks, and I feel like we've been kind of decoding that over the process of these 3 episodes, and probably will continue for the whole series. But I think for me, part of it is that the ducks come out of nature, and something that's really hard for Tony is that he can't control nature, and he wants to control everything. You have, in the opening sequence, he's kind of going upwards and upwards towards this house that he's built and created at the top of the hill. He's really kind of like the king of this domain. But the ducks are coming out of nature, and they're resting in that environment. They're in his pool, and he's caring for them and trying to be, going back to the power dynamic, kind of in control of them and helping them. But eventually they leave. He doesn't have control over nature. And then when he looks up, we have that shot. It's really imposing because he's just looking up at the sky where they've flown off to. And I think that's really hard for him because he truly doesn't have control over nature. And I think that keeps on coming back to haunt these characters in this episode through art, through environment, through where people are, through scenery. And I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, well, that painting too, I mean, it's all connected, so I'm going a little bit tangential, but that painting reminds me a lot of the painting he eventually gets of Pyomai.
Right.
And it's just like missing the horse, really, in a lot of ways. And I do believe there's also like a rotting tree of some sort. We're going to have to check back in on that.
Or the one of Tony as Napoleon.
I love the one of Tony as Napoleon. But I love when they focus it on that painting on the dark door, right? They focus it on the barn door.
Yeah.
In my recollection, I thought they focused it on the tree because in Melfi's conversation, they talk about the rotting tree. And so, like, when I was recalling this scene prior to watching the episode tonight, I was thinking more about the tree, but really they don't really focus on the tree. They focus on the door. And so when you said that about Artie's garage, that was actually really interesting because it is like dark blue and black door.
Yeah.
We see a lot of doors also like in the hospital scenes. There's definitely like an emphasis on those doors. So maybe we'll figure out how to unpack that as we talk.
To that hospital room, I think when they first show Jackie in there and everybody there, I think, again, there's this huge emphasis on blues. And it seems so deliberate. I'm starting to really think that it has to be intentional. The same way we were talking about it in the last episode. My best theory was that it was representing some kind of calming or stabilizing influence. And I think that is kind of, I'm feeling like there's some consistency there. I mean, as soon as you go into the hospital room, I mean, it's pretty extreme. Jackie's gown is blue, his blanket is blue, his TV is painted blue, the wall is blue, the IV liquids are blue. And then what's really interesting is that when they come back to the room later,
when the stripper's there,
I thought that they were in, when the stripper's there, I thought that they were in a different room, but it's not. It's the lighting. They really darken it.
Well, it almost greens it.
Right, but at the same time, when they open the door to the outside, when the nurse is coming in, and at the end when Tony walks out, it's extreme. It's all those very vibrant, deep blues. Mm-hmm. And you see the hospital doors, again, that are leading into these other medical rooms are that very deep, rich blue.
It's similar to the barn, to be honest. Like there was that blue quality, like dark blue quality to those doors as well.
And in a show where everything is this deliberate, I just feel like it's...
Oh, the blue, like now, when you start to pay attention to things, they just start to like kick you in the fucking face. Like,
or Christopher when he's going to see Meadow.
Yeah.
About the speed.
Yeah, he's wearing this blue polo shirt.
You wouldn't think that that's a stabilizing influence, but he's trying to do it in the most supportive way, and he's actually talked into it by Adriana because he cares for her and he cares for his family and he wants to keep her safe. And he's talking to her to calm her down in the moment, to be smart about it, to not introduce it to the rest of the family. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it's interesting how powerful that can be, just to have a color associated with something in the show.
Yeah. Now we do this without editing. We also do this without talking about it ahead of time, so we may jump around a little bit at times. I want to just circle back. Colors. I want to focus in on colors for sure.
Yeah.
But I want to circle back around to the paintings because I'd like to just like visit that topic as a whole instead of kind of going like scene by scene kind of thing. The other ones that really stood out to me, I'm just gonna like throw them out there. We can talk about them. When Carmela and Tony are in their bedroom, it's the first time we see them in like a quasi-sexual way, I guess, if you want to put it that way, although really non-sexual way compared to his the later scene when we see him with what's her name?
Arena.
But anyways, when Meadow's making too much noise, he actually pounds right on the painting that's hanging above their bed, which I thought was quite funny. You don't get a good shot of that painting, but he pounds right on it. And you're very aware of it in the scene. And then Carmela goes to Meadow's room, and Meadow's room is just covered in posters, like Teen Beat magazine posters, which I don't know if we would classify them as paintings, but that's the way that she chooses to decorate her room. And then we go to Irina's apartment, and she has some really neat art in her apartment. She has this one kind of like geometric piece. I'd like to know what it was. Yeah. But then Tony focuses in rather, on the pool scene where you see like evidence of someone having just jumped in. He focuses in a lot on the empty chair. That's where his eyes go, is to that empty chair. Yeah. And so then he asks her, like, what is this? Yeah. What do you think it means? Yeah. And she says it just reminds her of David Hockney. I think she means David Hockney because he has a painting that's quite like that.
The Big Splash or something?
But there's no chair in it, though. Okay. I think it's somewhere in New York. I think we should go visit it. Okay. But yeah, those are the ones that stood out for me, and I found myself kind of like, trying to keep track of a lot of things, but those are the ones that really stood out for me. Just the way that different people keep their art. And I think for me it's something kind of larger about art that you and I have been talking about, like in other contexts of our lives, that I think Sopranos, and we talk about it in the context of Sopranos as well, that the way that we interpret art and the way that we see art is so influenced by our current context, our current state of mind, right? So when you think about it in the context of like depression, for example, you are going to view things through a different lens than you do when you're less depressed. Watching Sopranos multiple times, right? I think we settled on the fact that we've watched it now for Alex 5 times. Every time I watch The Sopranos, I see different things hit me differently, or I see things differently. And so I thought that focus in on art was, for me, really representative kind of my whole experience with art, because it is so much about like, what does this mean to you? And what does it mean to you right now through your lens? And that's, I think, why I like seeing things through Tony's eyes, too, because it gives me that extra layer. Anyways.
Let's talk about that painting with the chair, though.
Yeah.
So, First of all, I think it's interesting. I mean, having this blank chair, this empty chair, definitely creates the impression that there is somebody in that space. And the splash also kind of suggests that somebody's just jumped, although we can't see them, which kind of ties to Tony's comment about Jackie being there and being not there. So we kind of have that aspect of the painting. But I think this episode is fascinating because I think it introduces this idea of a big nothing that becomes so central to the show. And we have that later. Christopher actually uses the term big nothing. But they talk about death being for something. Yeah.
And that called me to mind with like things being a big nothing.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's and I think that focus of Tony on the empty chair, he's definitely drawn to that idea that there's nothing there or there's nobody there. And it's definitely very interesting. And also that Irina doesn't see that in particular, that she just kind of perhaps mistakenly references the artist.
I don't know. No, I like what I think what she says is actually kind of deeper. Like she's knowledgeable enough to know about another painting, and she has this painting that reminds her of another painting. Yeah, it's actually kind of deep. Yeah, right. She like meant maybe again. It's hard to hear it if she says hockey or Hockney. Right.
So maybe.
So, you know,
we did put on our subtitles, but maybe they got it wrong.
They could also have gotten it wrong.
But I think in that Melfi session, you know, Tony talks about if all this shit's for nothing, why have we got to think about it? And that introduces Melfi bringing up, well, that's the big question. And I think that's the big question of the series. Yeah. It does have this kind of nihilistic approach, but then there's also these fleeting moments of there are things that matter. And there are things that matter for the family and for life, and it isn't completely bleak. There's humor, and there's sometimes a somewhat optimistic outlook on things, even though it's kind of framed in this extremely pessimistic, bleak worldview.
I love how she puts it, something, the gift of knowing that you're going to die. And she treats it as a gift, right? Yeah. But, and Tony talks about this in terms of like the Hasidic man in that episode not being afraid to die, and he says that he's not either, right? Which is interesting, you know. If we think about the end of the whole series, right? We can think about being afraid to die, or the gift of knowing that you're going to die, right?
I think that it's really interesting how it introduces that concept of principle and what it means to different characters. You know, we have Ariel, who talks about the story of the Masada and the 900 Jews against the 15,000 Romans. And he really does have this kind of tenacity and this willingness to kind of like be stoic in the face of death for his principles. And when you hear him describe everything in the situation, you are compassionate for him in some ways, because logically he does have grounds for what he believes in. But the question is Tony and his agents, are they monsters? Are they golems? And in some ways they are. They're just acting without any regards to principle or logic. They're just out for money. And in some ways, they're right. He is a golem. He is a monster.
Yeah, but, I mean, this show's the best at never classifying anything as black or white. So I was finding myself asking, like, well, was the Hasidic husband, was he actually abusing the daughter? Right. Or was the father-in-law just trying to get his money? Right. So calling someone a golem or a Frankenstein or a monster
doesn't acknowledge the problems with the characters who are saying those things.
Sure. And again,
the complexity
who is Tony? Like, we were talking about this in the car the other day. Like, is there anything redeeming about Tony Soprano?
I think that's a central question of this episode too. Yeah. And I think we're definitely supposed to be thinking about that at the end when he's going to see the choir performance. And actually I had a lot of thoughts on that. I think the show on first watch, in the way that you can see it on this kind of surface level, they kind of suggest to you, oh, there is more to this guy. Here he is, emotional at his daughter's choir performance. he's kind of fighting back tears. In the end of the last episode, he's fighting back tears over these emotions for his family. But if you actually look at the context and the realities of those situations, they're actually very bleak, and they're actually very representative of already what a horrible person he is and what he's involved in.
Well, where those emotions come from is also not necessarily related to the
Perhaps.
thing he's right there in at the moment.
And also, what I loved about this episode is during all those scenes, they're weaving in all the horrible stuff that the mob is doing at those exact moments.
Yeah.
And you can't differentiate those two things from his life. They're both happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So you have this violence and you have these emotional family times, and they're competing. They're competing for our attention as a viewer, and I think they're competing for the soul of Tony Soprano, but it tarnishes anything that could be humanizing, because as we're watching it, we know what's actually happening. We know that it's Tony who controlled these situations and made them happen.
It happens twice, at least in this. I mean, it happens all the time in this series, which again, it's that, you know, he never lets you see anything as black or white. But it happens when they're having their fundraising party at the house, and it cuts to that very quick scene of the trunk, right, of the car trunk when they're throwing the Hasidic guy in. And then it happens again in the last scene when Tony's at the choir concert, and then it flashes to them, you know, terrorizing Christopher and shooting Brendan.
Well, I love that at the dinner party, the fact that they have a scene where they're at the dinner party, and then they cut away from Carmela, and all of a sudden we're at this huge amount of violence where Ariel's being thrown into a car, and it's like a 9-second scene or something, and then we're just back, and it fades, and the edit they use is cut to black, and then we're on the back of Tony, his suit jacket, and then he walks in. But I was thinking about that. You don't really think about it because already they've introduced this world as everything's so linked, but that's such a bold move. You're at a dinner party, you establish the context, what's going on, and then we have 8 seconds of violence, and then you're just back at the dinner party.
Yeah.
Most shows would just stay at the dinner party, and you have that scene happen elsewhere.
Yeah, though that whole succession of scenes, and that's why, like, when I was remembering back this episode I love all the episodes, but I wasn't remembering it as a standout. That succession of scenes really got me, because then after that scene, so we go from the party to the trunk, back to the party, where Tony and Artie have this, like, pretty wonderful, I mean, in a lot of ways, interaction. Like, Artie's really pissed, and Tony's really pissed, but they kind of end up laughing. They're old friends, and you see Carmela watching from the outside in a kind of adoring and loving way. Like, she's not upset about this scenario, even though she's throwing this party and her husband's having a food fight in the kitchen, which might piss.
You'd be pissed.
I'd be so pissed. She was really being quite adoring, but then we go from that scene to Irina's apartment.
Right.
Well, and
And for me, I think that's another great example of, on surface, it's endearing, it's humanizing, but it's not.
No, I know. Exactly.
And even Tony's, that interaction with Artie is kind of fucked up.
Totally fucked.
The way that he's taking out his anger on Artie's depression kind of links back to the title of the episode and the way that all these characters are dealing with grief. I think the last scene is kind of a masterpiece. It's unbelievable.
Just like really starting there, like starting from the fundraiser party, all those scenes are just like boom,
amazing.
Boom, boom.
Yeah.
Like, it just like carries you to the end of that episode.
There was there was actually a lot of lighting decisions that I thought were really interesting, and it introduces something that we see later on. For instance, in college, and we'll talk about it when we're there, but they have that revolving shot around Tony's face, and it really starts to get to the heart of, like, okay, well, who is Tony, and seeing the different sides of his face, and having different lighting on different sides of his face, I think, can be really effective. And I think David Chase in the show, and in this episode in particular, lights people's faces dependent on what he's trying to communicate for their actions at a given time. We have in the session with Melfi, you have this, do you feel like a Frankenstein, in this very brightly lit face, and this two-toned lighting on Tony's face. And then what the other thing that I thought was really interesting was it kind of cut to Meadow, who's fully lit, and we have this relationship also between, I mean, everything's interlinked, but we have, we have Christopher, who's kind of getting threatened to be killed during Meadows' performance, and even that is linked, that Chris is yelling out that he thinks that it's because of Meadow. He thinks about it's about giving the speed. So this, again, that's another example of like this heartwarming family moment. Chris thinks that he's dying for getting in the way of the family, even though he's not. But there's just all this complexity about the way everything's lit at, at different points. Also, even like in the choir, they're all wearing like this two-tone black and white outfit.
Well, and so what does light allow us to see, right? So that's the thing that I always think about here. Light allows us to see people's flaws and people's darkness, if you even want to call it that. Like, for example, I was thinking about what you said, the Meadow thing, right? Her being so lit and on stage allowed us to see that she and Hunter were like rolling on speed.
Right.
They were sweating. Like, we were able to see the beads of sweat on their faces, right?
Right. Shining light on something.
Yeah. And so, like, although we, like, light and dark, there's that, like, they're opposites. Actually, like, light allows us to see sometimes people's darkness, or it at least allows us to see those flaws. But I think, like, he's kind of obsessed with that idea, I think, of blackness and whiteness and whatever the fuck is in between.
Well, actually, and that brings up something interesting, which is the song they use during the credits, the Elvis Costello, and they have these lyrics: should have never played with a gun in those complicated shadows. And that's something that I think is so key to watching this show. It's funny for a show that deals with so much subtext and reading between the lines and metaphors. Sometimes their use of music is so literal. And the lyrics can kind of just immediately tie into the themes of a given episode. We've like Comfortably Numb's a great example. At the very end, right now it's so relevant to what the episode is putting out there in terms of its main themes.
Yeah. Never should have played with a gun.
Complicated shadows.
Shadows. Yeah, totally. Complicated Shadows. It is.
Good band name.
It's a good band name. Maybe we should have called our podcast Complicated Shadows.
Well,
too bad. But yeah, no, Adam, let's pay attention to that as we keep going. And I know, like, that's something that's definitely obviously on purpose, right? When we film, we create our lighting very purposely. So I think that's...
Yeah, and I mean, there's other examples. Another thing, actually, in this episode was I was so impressed by the shots, the cinematography. There were some just beautiful shots. Tony walking into the motel at the end was just... Or
going up those stairs.
Going up the stairs, or when he's sitting on the stairs and kind of looking up. It just looks incredible. But yeah, so when we have Tony with Shlomo, and Shlomo's now trying to not give him the full amount, we have the camera spin around to the dark side of Tony's face. That's another example. Right when Shlomo's kind of saying, I've created a golem, a monster, a Frankenstein. You are mud. And as he's calling him mud, we kind of switch to that darker side.
Well, and you see it in the scene, right? Like, he puts his arm around Shlomo at first, like, kind of chummy. Yeah. And then pins him up against,
which is really interesting. Yeah. Very, very bright lighting from behind him, but we're looking at him from the dark side now. Yeah. And it's when he actually exercises violence against him.
Yeah. I want to come back to the color thing for a moment. Again, sorry to jump around. Green is really standing out to me this time. Okay. And I know, like, you captured some of the stuff about the blues, but the green moments were really getting to me. For example, Irina's whole apartment was super green. That's the first time we also see Tony in, like, again, kind of quasi-sexual interaction. We still don't see, it was in contrast to his scene with Carmela in their bedroom earlier, but it was an extraordinarily green room. We talked about green a little bit in the last episode as well, and the different scenes that were green. So I don't really have a working theory on it, except for maybe the tie-ins with that power and control and, like, domains, right? So, like, we see, like, he's placed Livia in green whatever it is, Green
Grove.
Green Grove, the nature stuff, Irina's apartment, which I think he pays for, right? If we
think they do.
I think that's
they do state that
something
later.
like that. So like the things that are either in his domain or wants to be in his domain or out of his domain.
I also think this is a great opportunity in Arena's apartment to use my Masters of Jazz performance and my relevant skill set that they were playing the song Tenderly.
Oh.
Make of that as you will.
I mean, I think, obviously they chose it on purpose, right? We do see moments where Tony comes across as very tender.
It's true.
You know?
Wow. Deep.
It is, but like, yeah, like I don't actually, those are the things I find like a little bit like not criticizing whatsoever, but like those are a little less deep, like the word for word meaning, like meaning of the lyrics. Like it's like, oh wow, that's really hitting us right over the head with that message, which is great,
but the thing
which I like.
But for me, it's not because you're not thinking about it.
Yeah.
When you're watching TV and you're watching film, you're not processing the lyrics on that level.
No,
Or at least
I'm
not. I don't know. I can only speak for myself. There's so much going on.
I listen to lyrics. I don't know. I'm a lyrics person.
But it's funny, like, it's almost hidden. It's like when we were watching the 3rd season of Twin Peaks or a lot of David Lynch things. He hides so much meaning in the soundtrack and the sound effects. And he's actually, like, so involved in the production at that level. And it's really interesting to see these filmmakers kind of using different disciplines to kind of, like, evoke feeling and to bring across meaning. And I think
totally
it's funny because it's so literal, but it's one step removed and you don't get it necessarily.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think probably David Lynch taught me how to do that. I don't think I like knew to do that before watching that. But yeah. What else did we want to talk about? I had some like minor things that I wanted to talk about. Well, just actually one more color thing, actually. And it goes back to kind of what I was saying about the black and white. It ties into other things, too. I love how we're introduced to characters in this episode that really represent the gray area, which I think is a relevant color term. Like Carmela. Like we're introduced to Rosalie April. And both of them have these moments, and well, Rosalie more so. Like all the dudes come into the hospital room, and they start to mention something that is violent. I'm not even sure at this point what it was, and she's like, "I'm gonna go to the cafeteria," and she steps out, like kind of just like blocking herself.
Denial.
Mm-hmm. Nice. We see it a little bit with Carmela. I know we like if we know the character of Carmela, we see it a lot more clearly in later episodes. But we see it with Adriana as well, who she's one of my favorite characters. But when Meadow comes to Chris's apartment with Hunter, and she brings up that thing, like that, a parenting argument, if you want to put it out there, like, well, isn't it better if we give it what did she say? Like, isn't it better if you give it to them instead of her going out to Jefferson Avenue or whatever they say? Which makes me think back to also, like, past times we've talked about, like, who is fit to be a parent and those good parenting decisions. And, of course, like, later on in the show, Adriana wants to be a parent.
Right.
Anyways, I just thought that just stood out. That just stood out to me, that whole gray area concept. And there was one scene that was very gray, and I commented on it when we were watching, but I can't remember. In Christopher's apartment.
Christopher
yeah.
And apartment.
And maybe Christopher is a more gray character than the rest of them too. Like we've been talking recently about, I don't know, I'm putting this out there. Maybe is Christopher's story arc my favorite? Maybe yes. But he's a very complex character, where the other characters are also complex, but you can kind of position them a little bit better. Whereas I think the characters in that apartment were very gray.
Yeah. I think, and another thing that you reminded me of there is just kind of the introduction of really fleshing out a lot of these woman characters.
Woman characters.
Woman that are characters. Woman character. I was trying to say, fleshing out women as characters.
Okay.
How's that?
It's okay.
It's okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I did okay.
Yeah.
No, I didn't do okay. I did pretty bad. But,
no.
Okay, that's all right. I think.
How about female characters?
Female characters. Okay. That's much better. So I think what struck me is that from watching a lot of shows, I'm struck by the fact that the writing brings my attention to that female characters aren't believable in some way. I feel like there's a man
Totally.
writing them, and that the women don't come across as believable women. And that there's a lot of shows, without naming names, perhaps our other favorite show, and maybe something that makes this my favorite show is the fact that it has this dimension, this believability, this reality, and this female perspective that comes across in the writing and through the characters that I don't think happens in that much TV, which is really unfortunate and sad. But I think this show just is such deep, incredible writing that it can accurately portray such a wide range of perspectives.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing too, in terms of the female characters, is they're not just kind of like bit parts, which I feel like in other shows, Rhonda Perlman perhaps as a character.
You went there.
I know. But those, I don't know, I just see like so many female characters who are written as supporting the male protagonist or as like a little side story for the male protagonist. But here, the whole dynamic between masculinity and femininity and between men and women is essential to the show. And so I think that's why we have such great female characters in The Sopranos, even though, yes, a lot of the action does center around this like boys club. Mm-hmm. We have amazingly complex and believable characters. I mean, all throughout, not just the female characters, obviously, but it does stand out in contrast to other shows.
And that these characters aren't supporting, that they're integral to the story, and perhaps even looking at these female spaces and the framing of the whole show is that they're maybe even the most important. Even with Tony as a protagonist, it's obvious how central the impact of the women in his life are on his psyche. So even with him as a narrator, there's an ensemble of characters that are really central to everything that's happening in this show.
Yeah, I mean, you could also say it's a show about a family too, right? Like family in multiple contexts, obviously, but families have female and male participants in a family, right? That's what fleshes out a whole idea. And so even though, yes, there aren't like women directly in the mob family, they are essential to that family as well, right? Like Livia and Johnny Boy and, this whole history.
Totally. I just think that there's so many incredible characters that bring something different to the show based on their relationship within the families. So characters like Carmela, like Meadow, even Hunter Scangarello, David Chase's daughter, little trivia piece. But we have all these characters who have such a different relationship to what's going on than what we've seen in the first 2 episodes. Mm-hmm. And I think it really starts to strengthen those characters. We start to see them acting in ways that's already so deep.
Yeah.
And
Charmaine we talked about a little bit.
Charmaine, of course.
Yeah,
another one. And it's really interesting to see the dynamics and the power dynamics between different groups of characters. I actually found the stuff between Carmela and Tony in that first episode. Sorry, in that early portion of the episode where they go to their house. First of all, I thought that was interesting because we cut to it from a scene of like extreme violence where they're hitting Ariel on the head with a bell.
Kind of like with the
It's
phone.
so graphic.
Yeah.
But I feel like anytime they have this kind of graphic violence, there's typically a point to it. And then to immediately cut from there to this domestic environment, this like beautiful house, in an episode where Carmela, goes and says, "Oh, I love the coziness of your house," obviously is kind of like this like underhanded insult. Yeah. And then later on, talking like, "Oh, I didn't know how to
She was trying to find nice things to say."
Yeah, well, great job.
Yeah.
But, I think it's that, again, it's this, the violence and the life that they have and all the luxuries that they have are so intertwined.
Yeah.
But I thought, it was really interesting. We start to see Carmela asserting herself a little bit, starting to push with more questions, like was it arson? You know, there's an aspect of her coming to grips with that blood money.
Yeah.
And coming to grips with the fact that her life is built on violence.
Yeah. Well, in terms of like mothers, or even like in terms of wives, we definitely can look at Carmela and Charmaine, I think a great comparison, and we touched on that a little bit, but Carmela and Livia, who we only see in one scene this episode, she's hanging up some art in her retirement room.
Yeah.
And it's a picture of AJ, which I was always wondering,
Right.
like, is she going to hang one up of Meadow? Like, why is just AJ there? But, like, she's obviously the result of being in a relationship with Johnny Soprano, who, again, this kind of specter who lingers over everything. But is that, like, and she's then basically telling Junior that they should kill Brendan in so few words, and then kind of denying that she insinuated it. It's such great acting in that scene. She's amazing.
Well, that's an interesting...
But is that Carmela, like, is that Carmela's future by being with someone like Tony for the long term? Or are they different? Is their experience going to be different? Are they different women? I mean, they clearly are, but what are the implications of being the partner to someone who's in that line of work?
I think everybody has a different relationship with it. We see it evolve differently for Carmela, for Rosalie, yeah, and
for Charmaine.
Yeah. And it's that great line where Charmaine says, you know, I'm comfortable with my decisions.
Yeah.
I'm happy with where I am. One thing that was interesting in that scene with Livia is that focus on paintings again. It's really a link to the other things that are happening in the episode, that they're putting up
Junior's hanging up the paintings.
There's these kind of like classic landscape paintings. But one thing I noticed is that there was a way that things were shot where Tony was looking at the barn and the tree, where you see him and behind him is the tree, is the painting, and you really see the greenery, the nature behind him. Mm-hmm. And when Livia is talking to Junior, there's a painting with greenery and scenery, and behind her you see a very similar kind of outline within the painting. And it happens at a time where she's kind of exerting her control over the situation in a way that Tony often is. She's really kind of, I'm starting to see on this viewing, she's really one of the major players. Totally. I think in the first few viewings, I was kind of tricked by her act. Yeah. In a lot of ways. Even though if I could kind of see what was going on, you kind of think of her as this kind of senile old lady.
Well, when she calls herself a babbling idiot in this episode, right?
It's this kind of brilliant...
She's brilliant.
She's a brilliant sociopath. She's kind of manipulating everybody. But to do what she wants, when she's talking about Brendan, she says, oh... I don't know him. It's so conscious. Yeah. But I feel like that is her exerting her control, and that's her dealing with the specter of nature and being unable to control that, and that maybe even being a generational thing that's passed down from Livia to Tony, and that's something that exists within that family unit. That's something that they're all dealing with.
That's interesting. It's also interesting in the context of the whole conversation around Romans, right? So, in the scene in Tony and Carmela's bedroom, she's like, I forget what he says, but then she's like, oh, we could go back to Italy, we can own a B&B, and this kind of this more like simple way of life in some ways. And then we get the conversations like, in terms of generationally, right? I love that line where the son-in-law is talking about the Romans and the Jews. He says, and where are the Romans now? Yeah. And Tony says, you're looking at them. I think that's like so...
And then when we go to a shot shortly thereafter in their house, there's these kind of like classic columns. It's a very deliberate shot that makes their house evoke Roman architecture.
Yeah. So it is kind of this like... And the Romans were one of the first great civilizations, if you want to call it that. And civilizing really does deal with controlling nature. I mean, when we, control livestock, when we cut down trees, civilizing is all about that level of control over our environment. Building the cathedral.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something.
A great episode.
I think a really great episode. I know. We were reading up on some of the other, like, some of the Sopranos analyses that we
Sopranos
enjoy.
Community.
The Sopranos Community. But even in, which one was it? Maybe it was AV Club or something that put this episode together with the past episode. I'm like, these deserve to stand totally on their own. Why is that? What else? Is there anything else we wanted to talk about?
I had something. I'm trying to see. I said the jazz standard. I was very proud of my skill set.
That's also, I was going to go back to that, the tenderly. That's the first time we actually like see Tony as a sexual person too. Again, I mentioned it with the Carmela thing.
It's true, actually. We haven't seen him.
We see him out to dinner with not Irina, but Irina in the first episode. Yeah. But we just start to get a taste of that as part of his humanity, if you want to call it that. Although we do get that line too about Frankenstein, that he's lacking humanity.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, sex is something that makes people human. Food.
Yeah.
Like, what is humanity? I don't know, or being human.
Yeah. I think it was also going to what we were reading. I think it was Sopranos Autopsy, which we're big fans of. I don't know if we've shouted them out yet, but it's an amazing resource for
if you like
answering
Sopranos.
if you like Sopranos and these kinds of questions and reading and all that. It's an amazing place. But they did a great. I'm pretty sure it was them. They did a great job of linking the final montage scene to The Godfather and the killing of Mo Green and the baptism scene.
Oh, okay.
So they had Brendan being shot, the focus on his eye, Mo Green being shot through the eye, the focus on water, the mixing of these kind of domestic family scenes with violence at the same time of...
So Godfather.
Yeah, well, what isn't? It's a pretty OG movie. I think I got to go out on that. That was good. I like that.
That's
I mean, it
That's
wasn't
all you
that
want to
good.
say?
No.
That's all you want to say?
It wasn't that good. That sucked.
What else?
I think we're good. I made an OG reference that's kind of gangster. It's like
so gangster.
Yeah, I think I can't top that.
Okay.
All right. Well, we loved the episode.
Yeah.
It's great. We'll be back for another one.
What's the next episode?
That's a great question.
Oh, Meadowlands.
Whoa, Meadowlands. Yeah. Okay. All
right.
Coming up to college, that'll be exciting.
It's gonna be good.
Yeah. Well, Thanks for listening. If you've listened this far.
Yeah.
And
at the end.
See you next time.
Bye.